In the harsh mountains of Colorado Territory, 1889, survival means making do with nothing. CLARA MORGAN, 43 and weathered by frontier life, shares her one-room shack with Rusty, a loyal mutt who showed up starving 3 winters ago. Their cupboards hold only empty promises, and the harsh winter ahead threatens to claim what little they have left. Clara watches Rusty dig frantically behind their cabin, his paws working the frozen earth with unusual determination. For 3 days, he returns to the same spot, ignoring her calls to stop. When Clara finally investigates, her shovel strikes something solid beneath the dirt. What emerges from that hole will transform her from the poorest woman in Copper Creek Valley into its wealthiest resident. But how did $3 million worth of gold end up buried behind a penniless woman's shack, and who put it there? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled through the gaps in the shack's weathered walls like a dying animal, carrying with it the promise of another brutal mountain winter. Clara Morgan pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders and stirred the thin soup that would serve as both breakfast and dinner. The meager broth, made from turnip peels and whatever scraps she could find, barely deserved the name. Rusty lay curled on a pile of old blankets near the fireplace, his amber eyes following Clara's every movement. The dog had appeared at her door 3 winters ago, half-starved and limping from what looked like a wolf attack. Clara had shared her last piece of bread with him, though she could hardly spare it. Since then, Rusty had become her constant companion, her only friend in this unforgiving wilderness. On the mantelpiece, propped against a cracked mirror, stood a faded daguerreotype in a tarnished silver frame. The image showed 2 young women in their Sunday best, arms linked and smiling at the camera. Clara often found herself staring at that photograph, remembering when she and her sister Martha had posed for it in Kansas City, full of dreams about their new life in Colorado Territory. Martha had been the optimist, the one who convinced Clara to leave the comfort of their childhood home for the promise of gold and adventure in the mountains. "We'll make our fortune, Clara," Martha had said, her eyes bright with possibility. "We'll have our own land, our own house, and we'll never have to depend on anyone again." That was 5 years ago. Martha lay buried now beneath the lone pine tree behind the shack, claimed by consumption during their 2nd winter in Copper Creek Valley. Clara had been alone ever since, except for Rusty. The nearest neighbors lived 3 miles down the mountain in the small settlement of Copper Creek. The town consisted of little more than a general store, a saloon, a church, and a handful of houses clustered around a single dirt road. Most of the residents were miners, loggers, or ranchers who had come west seeking their own fortunes and found only hard work and harder winters. Clara rarely ventured into town unless absolutely necessary. When she did, she could feel the weight of their stares, hear the whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. To them, she was the poor widow woman, living in a shack on the mountain, surviving on charity and whatever small jobs she could find. The truth was more complicated. Clara had been married briefly to a prospector named Thomas Morgan, a kind but foolish man who died in a mining accident 6 months after their wedding. She had kept his name but little else. His claims had proven worthless, and his debts had consumed what few possessions they owned. Clara's survival depended on her skill with a needle. She took in mending and tailoring work when she could get it, stitching by candlelight to preserve thread and fabric. Her fingers, once soft and delicate, now bore the permanent marks of countless needle pricks and the roughness of frontier life. The shack itself was a testament to desperation rather than craftsmanship. Built hastily by Thomas from whatever lumber he could afford, it consisted of a single room with a stone fireplace, a small sleeping area separated by a hanging blanket, and a lean-to kitchen that barely deserved the name. The roof leaked in 3 places, which Clara caught with tin pans during rainstorms. Winter was coming early this year. Clara could feel it in her bones, see it in the way the aspen leaves had already begun to turn gold while September still held the calendar. She had managed to store a few potatoes and turnips in the root cellar. Thomas had dug, along with some dried beans and a precious bag of flour that would have to last until spring. Rusty suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked forward. A low growl rumbled in his throat, the kind of sound he made when strangers approached. Clara moved to the single window and peered through the grimy glass. In the distance she could see a figure on horseback, picking his way up the mountain trail. As the rider drew closer, Clara recognized Sheriff William Thorne, a large man with graying whiskers and a perpetually serious expression. He rarely ventured this far up the mountain unless there was trouble, and Clara's heart began to race as she wondered what might have brought him to her door. Thorne dismounted and tied his horse to the fence post Clara had erected to keep what few chickens she owned from wandering into the wilderness. His boots made heavy sounds on the wooden steps as he approached the door. "Mrs. Morgan," he called out in his deep, authoritative voice. "Might I have a word with you?" Clara opened the door slowly, her hand instinctively reaching for the old hunting rifle Thomas had left behind. Sheriff Thorne noticed the gesture and raised his hand slightly, a peaceful smile crossing his weathered face. "No trouble, Mrs. Morgan, just checking on folks before the winter sets in proper." His eyes swept over Clara's thin frame and the sparse interior visible behind her. "Heard you might be having some difficulties up here." "We managed just fine, Sheriff." Clara's voice carried the defensive edge of someone who had heard too many offers of charity, disguised as concern. "Rusty and I don't need anything from town." Thorne nodded toward the dog, who had positioned himself protectively between Clara and the visitor. "That's a fine animal you have there. Looks like he's been taking good care of you." "He has his moments." Clara softened slightly. Few people bothered to acknowledge Rusty as anything more than a mangy stray. "What brings you all the way up the mountain, Sheriff?" "Well, truth is, I've had some complaints about someone digging around the old mining claims up this way. Thought you might have seen or heard something unusual." Thorne's eyes studied Clara's face carefully. "Some of the boys down in town think there might be claim jumpers working the area." Clara's heart began to race, but she kept her expression neutral. For the past 3 days she had been watching Rusty's obsessive digging with growing curiosity and concern. The dog had never shown such behavior before, returning again and again to the same spot behind the shack despite her calls to stop. "Can't say I've noticed anything out of the ordinary." The lie came easier than Clara expected. "Course, I don't get around much these days. Mind if I take a look around, just to be thorough?" Thorne's request sounded casual, but Clara caught the underlying authority in his voice. "I suppose that would be fine." Clara stepped aside, allowing the sheriff to enter the cramped shack. Rusty followed closely, his amber eyes never leaving the visitor. Thorne's inspection was brief but thorough. He noted the patched roof, the meager supplies, and the general air of poverty that clung to everything in the small space. When he picked up Martha's photograph from the mantelpiece, Clara tensed. "Your sister?" he asked gently. "Yes, Martha. She passed 2 winters ago. I remember. Tucson, wasn't it?" Thorne set the photograph down carefully. "Hard thing, losing family out here. Makes a person appreciate whatever company they can find." After Sheriff Thorne left, Clara waited until his horse disappeared down the mountain trail before venturing outside. Rusty immediately led her to the spot behind the shack where he had been digging, his tail wagging with excitement. The hole was deeper than Clara had realized, nearly 3 feet down and perfectly circular, as if Rusty had been following some invisible boundary. Clara knelt beside the excavation and peered into the dark earth. Something glinted in the afternoon sunlight, something that definitely wasn't rock or root. Clara retrieved Thomas's old shovel from the lean-to and began to dig carefully. The mountain soil was rocky and unforgiving, but she persisted, driven by a growing sense of anticipation. Rusty paced around the hole, occasionally whimpering with excitement. 15 minutes later, Clara's shovel struck something solid, not stone, but wood. Old wood, weathered, but still intact. She cleared the dirt away with her hands, revealing the corner of what appeared to be a wooden box, ornately carved with intricate patterns that spoke of skilled craftsmanship. The box was heavier than its size suggested, requiring all of Clara's strength to lift it from the hole. The wood was dark with age, but the carvings remained distinct. Strange symbols covered the lid, resembling no language Clara had ever seen. The metal hinges and lock were green with verdigris, but they appeared functional. Clara carried the box into the shack and set it on her small kitchen table. Her hands trembled as she examined the mysterious container more closely. The symbols carved into the lid seemed to shift and dance in the flickering candlelight, creating shadows that suggested meaning just beyond her understanding. The lock had long since corroded beyond use, and Clara was able to pry the lid open with the tip of her kitchen knife. The hinges creaked in protest, releasing the musty scent of old paper and metal. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather that had somehow survived the decades underground, Clara found 3 items that would change her life forever. The first was a collection of hand-drawn maps, their edges yellowed with age but their lines still clear and precise. The second was a leather-bound journal, its pages covered with flowing script in what appeared to be Spanish. The third was a small leather pouch that clinked softly when Clara lifted it. She opened the pouch with shaking fingers and gasped. Inside were 12 gold coins, each one bearing the image of a pasha's crown and inscriptions in a language she couldn't read. Even in the dim candlelight, the gold gleamed with unmistakable authenticity. Clara sank into her only chair, the implications of her discovery washing over her like a mountain avalanche. This was no simple treasure chest left behind by a careless prospect. The craftsmanship of the box, the age of the documents, and the foreign script all pointed to something far more significant. Rusty settled at her feet, his work apparently complete. He looked up at Clara with an expression that seemed almost human in its satisfaction, as if he had known all along what lay buried behind their humble shack. Clara spent the entire night hunched over the Spanish journal by candlelight, her eyes straining to decipher the foreign script. Years of reading Martha's letters and Thomas's mining reports had given her some skill at interpreting difficult handwriting, but this was unlike anything she had ever encountered. The leather binding was soft with age, and the pages crackled like autumn leaves as she turned them carefully. The ink had faded to a rusty brown, but the words remained legible to someone willing to work at understanding them. Clara had studied some Spanish during her brief time at the Kansas City Ladies' Seminary, though she had never expected that education to prove useful in a Colorado mountain shack. Gradually, words began to emerge from the flowing script. Capitan Miguel Rodriguez appeared repeatedly, along with dates from 1847. Clara recognized oro as the Spanish word for gold, and tesoro seemed to mean treasure. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to piece together the story hidden within the journal's pages. Captain Miguel Rodriguez had been leading a Spanish treasure expedition from the silver mines of Mexico to the California coast, following routes established by earlier conquistadors. His party consisted of 12 soldiers and 8 pack mules carrying chests of gold and silver, destined for Spanish ships that would transport the precious metals back to Spain. But something had gone wrong. Clara found entries describing attacks by bandits, difficult mountain passes, and dwindling supplies. Rodriguez wrote of his growing certainty that someone in his party had betrayed their route to the outlaws, who seemed to anticipate their every move. No podemos continuar, one entry read. Clara puzzled over the words until their meaning became clear. We cannot continue. Rodriguez described making the agonizing decision to bury the treasure rather than risk losing it to the bandits who pursued them. The captain's writing became increasingly desperate as Clara read on. His men were dying from wounds sustained in skirmishes with the outlaws. Their horses were lame, their supplies exhausted. Winter was approaching, and they were trapped in unfamiliar mountains, with enemies closing in from all directions. Rodriguez had chosen this location carefully. The rocky outcropping behind Clara's shack provided natural protection from wind and weather, while the sparse vegetation would quickly hide any signs of disturbance. He described the burial process in meticulous detail, creating a record that would allow him to return and recover the treasure once the danger had passed. but Rodriguez never returned. The final entries in his journal, written in an increasingly shaky hand, described fever and infection setting in from a wound sustained during their last battle with the bandits. He wrote of his growing certainty that he would die in these mountains, taking the secret of the treasure's location with him. Dios mío, he had written in his final entry, que alguien digno encuentre lo que no pude proteger. Clara worked through the translation. My God, may someone worthy find what I could not protect. The maps spread across Clara's table showed the surrounding territory with remarkable accuracy. Rodriguez had been a skilled cartographer as well as a soldier, documenting mountain passes, water sources, and landmarks with the precision of a professional surveyor. One map showed the location of the main treasure cache, marked with symbols that corresponded to the rocky outcropping behind Clara's shack. But the maps revealed something that made Clara's hands shake with excitement and terror. The X marking the treasure location was not singular. 3 separate maps showed 3 different burial sites, each marked with the same mysterious symbols, each indicating a cache of gold and silver that Rodriguez had been forced to abandon. Clara studied the landmarks carefully, comparing Rodriguez's century-old observations with the current landscape visible from her window. The second cache appeared to be located near a distinctive rock formation, about half a mile up the mountain, while the third was marked near what the map indicated was a natural spring. The leather pouch containing the 12 gold coins now took on new significance. These were not the treasure itself, but merely samples Rodriguez had kept for identification purposes. Each coin bore markings that would allow Spanish authorities to verify the authenticity of the recovered treasure. Clara calculated the potential value based on Rodriguez's inventory notes. Conservative estimates suggested each cache contained enough gold and silver to purchase a small town. Combined, the 3 burial sites might hold wealth beyond anything she had ever imagined. As dawn approached, Clara carefully returned the journal and maps to their oiled leather wrapping. The magnitude of her discovery was overwhelming. She possessed not just a fortune, but a historical treasure that had been lost for over 40 years. The Spanish government might still claim ownership, assuming they even knew the treasure existed. More immediately pressing was the question of what to do with this knowledge. Rodriguez had died protecting these secrets from bandits and outlaws. Clara wondered what modern equivalent of those dangers might emerge if word of her discovery spread through Copper Creek Valley. Rusty stirred from his place by the fireplace, stretching and padding over to where Clara sat. The dog seemed to sense the weight of the moment, resting his head against her leg in a gesture of comfort and solidarity. Outside, the first light of morning was beginning to filter through the mountain peaks, promising another day of difficult decisions and dangerous possibilities. 2 days later, Clara's empty stomach forced her into town despite her desire to avoid the curious stares of Copper Creek's residents. She had carefully selected one of the smaller Spanish coins from Rodriguez's pouch, hoping it might pass for an old American piece if no one examined it too closely. The general store occupied the largest building on Copper Creek's single main street, its weathered wooden sign reading Henderson's Mercantile in faded paint. Mrs. Abigail Henderson, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, had run the establishment since her husband's death 3 years prior. She knew every customer's financial situation and wasn't shy about extending credit to those she deemed worthy. Clara pushed through the door, causing the brass bell overhead to announce her arrival with a sharp jangle. The familiar smells of coffee, leather, and dried goods filled her nostrils, reminding her of better times when she could afford to shop without counting every penny twice. Mrs. Morgan, Mrs. Henderson called from behind the counter, where she was tallying figures in a thick ledger. Haven't seen you in a while. How are you managing up on the mountain? Well enough. Clara moved through the narrow aisles, gathering essential supplies, flour, coffee, beans, and a small piece of salt pork that would provide protein for several meals. She avoided the luxury items that lined the higher shelves, though her eyes lingered on a bolt of blue fabric that would make a beautiful dress. At the counter, Clara placed her modest purchases beside Mrs. Henderson's scales. The total came to $3.47, more than Clara usually spent in a month. Mrs. Henderson eyed the meager pile of goods with the practiced assessment of someone who understood frontier poverty. "Will that be on account, Mrs. Morgan?" Clara reached into her coat pocket and withdrew the Spanish coin, set it carefully on the counter. "I believe this should cover it." Mrs. Henderson picked up the coin and examined it closely, her expression shifting from routine courtesy to genuine surprise. The silver piece was larger than a standard American dollar, its surface covered with unfamiliar markings and the image of a crowned figure. Clara assumed represented Spanish royalty. "This is quite unusual," Mrs. Henderson said slowly, turning the coin over in her palm.
"Where did you come by such a thing?"
Clara had prepared for this question during her walk to town. "It belonged to my late husband. I found it among his effects while cleaning out old trunks." The lie came easier than she expected, though she felt a flush of guilt for deceiving the woman who had extended her credit during difficult times. "Your husband collected old coins?" Thomas had many interests. Clara kept her voice steady, though her heart was racing. "He often said you never knew what might prove valuable someday." Mrs. Henderson continued to study the coin, her merchant's instincts clearly intrigued by its unusual appearance. "I'm not sure of the exchange rate for foreign currency. This appears to be silver, and it's certainly old, but I'd need to have it evaluated properly. I understand it's worth considerably more than $3, Clara said carefully. "Perhaps you could consider it payment for today's purchases, plus credit toward future needs." Before Miss Henderson could respond, the store's door chimed again. Sheriff Thorne entered, removing his hat and nodding politely to both women. His timing felt like divine intervention to Clara, who was growing increasingly uncomfortable under Mrs. Henderson's scrutiny. "Afternoon, ladies," Thorne said, approaching the counter. "Mrs. Henderson, I was hoping you might have received that shipment of ammunition I ordered." Mrs. Henderson reluctantly set the Spanish coin aside and reached beneath the counter for a wooden box marked with Thorne's name. As she conducted business with the sheriff, Clara noticed his eyes briefly settle on the unusual coin lying on the counter. "That's an interesting piece," Thorne observed casually. "Don't see many old Spanish coins in these parts." Clara's mouth went dry. "It was my husband's," she managed to say. Thorne picked up the coin and examined it with the careful attention of someone familiar with evidence and unusual objects. "Looks authentic. Spanish colonial period, I'd guess. Probably worth quite a bit to the right collector." Miss Henderson's eyes sharpened at this assessment. "More than $3. Considerably more, I'd imagine." Thorne handed the coin back to Clara with a thoughtful expression. "Your husband had good taste in collectibles, Mrs. Morgan." Clara completed her transaction quickly, accepting $20 in credit for the coin, while promising herself she would be more careful in the future. As she prepared to leave with her supplies, she overheard Miss Henderson and Sheriff Thorne beginning a whispered conversation about the unusual currency. The walk back up the mountain felt longer than usual, weighted down by both her purchases and the growing certainty that her secret would not remain hidden for long. Word traveled fast in small communities, and an impoverished widow suddenly possessing valuable Spanish coins would certainly generate conversation and speculation. Rusty greeted her return with enthusiastic tail-wagging, but Clara found little comfort in his loyalty. She had made her first mistake, and she suspected it would not be her last. The treasure that promised to solve all her problems was already creating new ones she had never anticipated. That evening, as Clara prepared a more substantial meal than she had enjoyed in months, she noticed riders passing on the distant trail below her property. Two men on horseback, moving slowly and studying the mountainside with obvious interest. She watched them until they disappeared around a bend, wondering if their presence was coincidental or if word of Spanish gold was spreading beyond Copper Creek's borders. The telegraph message arrived at Henderson's Mercantile on a crisp Thursday morning, crackling across the wires from Denver, with news that would transform Clara's quiet mountain existence into something far more dangerous. Miss Henderson read the yellow paper twice before hurrying to find Sheriff Thorne, her face pale with excitement and concern. "Sheriff, you need to see this immediately," she said, thrusting the telegram into his weathered hands. It's about that Spanish coin Mrs. Morgan brought in. Thorne adjusted his spectacles and read the message slowly. A collector in Denver, contacted by Mrs. Henderson through the territorial telegraph system, had identified the coin as extremely rare and valuable. More troubling, he mentioned rumors circulating among treasure hunters about lost Spanish gold somewhere in the Colorado mountains. Says here there's been talk in the mining camps about a Spanish treasure expedition that disappeared in these parts 40 years ago, Thorne said grimly. Apparently some folks in Denver have been piecing together old maps and stories, trying to locate the burial sites. Mrs. Henderson wrung her hands nervously. Do you think Mrs. Morgan knows what she's stumbled onto? Before Thorne could answer, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the store's front window. Two men dismounted outside, their appearance immediately marking them as outsiders. They wore expensive leather coats and carried themselves with the confident swagger of men, accustomed to taking what they wanted. The Morrison brothers, Jake and Samuel, had built their reputation on finding things other people had lost or hidden. They specialized in recovering abandoned mining claims, locating buried caches, and tracking down valuable items that had disappeared into the wilderness. Their methods were not always legal, but they were invariably effective. Jake Morrison, the older of the two, pushed through the store's door with barely contained energy. His dark eyes swept over the interior with predatory intensity, cataloging every detail as potential information. Samuel followed more quietly, his pale gaze settling on Sheriff Thorne with calculating assessment. Afternoon, Jake said, his voice carrying a slight southern accent that hinted at origins far from Colorado territory. We're looking for information about Spanish artifacts that might have surfaced in this area recently. Mrs. Henderson exchanged a nervous glance with Sheriff Thorne. What kind of artifacts? Old coins, maps, jewelry, anything that might have belonged to a Spanish expedition from the... Samuel stepped forward, producing a small leather pouch from his coat. We're authorized representatives of the Territorial Historical Society, investigating reports of significant archaeological discovery. The credentials Samuel displayed looked official enough, though Sheriff Thorne's experienced eye caught subtle inconsistencies in the documentation. The paper was too new, the seals too perfect, the language too convenient for men who clearly operated outside normal legal channels. Can't say we've heard anything about Spanish treasures, Thorne said carefully. This is mining country. Most of what gets dug up around here is copper and silver ore. Jake's smile didn't reach his eyes. We have reliable information suggesting otherwise. Someone in this area has recently acquired Spanish colonial coins of considerable value. Our investigation indicates these items may be part of a larger archaeological site that requires professional excavation. Mrs. Henderson shifted uncomfortably behind her counter. The Spanish coin Clara had used for payment was still locked in her strongbox, and she was beginning to realize she might have become involved in something far more complex than a simple currency exchange. The Territorial Historical Society is prepared to offer substantial rewards for information leading to the recovery of these artifacts, Samuel added, producing a roll of paper money thick enough to represent more cash than most Copper Creek residents saw in a year. We're particularly interested in speaking with anyone who might have discovered old maps or documents. Sheriff Thorne's hand moved instinctively closer to his sidearm. What makes you think these artifacts are in our area specifically? Let's say we have our sources, Jake replied. Word travels fast in collector circles. When something as rare as the 1847 Spanish colonial peso surfaces in a remote mountain town, people take notice. The description was specific enough to make Mrs. Henderson's heart race. The coin Clara had brought in matched that description perfectly, and she realized the Morrison brothers might already know more about the situation than they were revealing. We'll be staying at the hotel for a few days, Samuel announced, conducting interviews with local residents and examining any relevant materials. We trust we'll have the full cooperation of local law enforcement. It wasn't really a question, and Sheriff Thorne understood the implicit threat in the statement. The Morrison brothers had the resources and connections to make life difficult for anyone who interfered with their investigation. After the strangers left, Miss Henderson locked the store's door and pulled the window shades. Sheriff, that poor woman has no idea what she's gotten herself into. Those men aren't from any historical society. No, they're not, Thorne agreed grimly. And if they're willing to come this far based on rumors about one coin, there's a lot more to this story than Mrs. Rogan has told us. The telegraph key began chattering again, announcing another incoming message. Miss Henderson transcribed the Morse code with shaking fingers, her face growing paler with each word. It's from the Denver Marshal's office, she whispered. The Morrison brothers are wanted for questioning in connection with several violent robberies. They're considered extremely dangerous. James Cooper arrived at Clara's shack the following morning, carrying a leather satchel and wearing the serious expression of a man bearing important news. As Copper Creek's only surveyor, James possessed knowledge of property boundaries, mining claims, and territorial law that made him invaluable to anyone dealing with land disputes or legal complications. At 38, James had the lean build and careful movements of someone who spent his days traversing difficult terrain with expensive equipment. His sandy hair was prematurely gray at the temples, and his blue eyes held the steady gaze of a man accustomed to making precise measurements in an imprecise world. Mrs. Morgan, he called from the gate. I hope you don't mind an early visitor. Sheriff Thorne suggested I might be of assistance with some legal matters you're facing. Clara opened the door cautiously, still wearing the simple dress she had slept in. Rusty emerged from the shack and approached James with cautious interest, sniffing the newcomer's boots and equipment before settling into a watchful crouch. I'm not sure what legal matters the sheriff might be referring to, Clara said, though her stomach tightened with anxiety. I haven't broken any laws. James smiled reassuringly and gestured toward his satchel. Nothing like that, Mum. I understand you've come into possession of some items that might have significant value. Sheriff Thorne thought you should understand your rights regarding anything found on your property. Clara studied James's face carefully, searching for signs of deception or hidden agenda. She had learned to be suspicious of unexpected kindness, especially from men she barely knew. But James's manner seemed genuinely helpful, rather than predatory. Would you mind if I came inside? This conversation might be better conducted in private. Clara stepped aside to allow James entry, noting how he removed his hat respectfully and wiped his boots on the threshold. Rusty followed them inside, positioning himself where he could observe both humans while remaining close to Clara. James spread several official-looking documents across Clara's small table, weighing down the corners with stones he pulled from his pocket. These are territorial surveys of your property, dating back to when your late husband filed his homestead claim. According to these records, you own 12 acres of land extending from the creek below up to the ridge behind your house. Clara leaned over the documents, studying the careful lines and measurements that defined her small piece of the world. Thomas never showed me these papers. Many homesteaders don't fully understand the legal implications of their claims, James explained gently. But these surveys establish important precedents regarding your rights to anything discovered on your land. He pointed to specific sections of the territorial statute printed along the document's margins. Under Colorado territorial law, any artifacts, minerals, or valuable items found on properly claimed homestead land belong to the landowner, provided the claim was filed legally and taxes have been paid. Clara's heart began to race. What if someone had buried something on the land before the homestead was established? Doesn't matter, James said firmly. Prior burial doesn't establish legal ownership. If someone buried treasure on unclaimed land and then abandoned it for more than 7 years, it legally belongs to whoever holds the current deed. Clara sank into her chair, overwhelmed by the implications. So anything found on my property belongs to me? Absolutely. But there are complications you should understand. James pulled out another document, this one bearing official territorial seals. I've been researching Spanish land grants and mining concessions from the 1840s. There's no record of any Spanish expedition having legal claim to this territory. Spain lost control of this region to Mexico in 1821, and Mexico ceded it to the United States in 1848. The information was almost too much to process. Clara had spent days worrying about the legal ownership of Rodriguez's treasure, fearing that Spanish authorities might still claim it. Learning that she had clear legal title to anything found on her land felt like divine intervention. "But there's something else you need to know," James continued, his expression growing more serious. "Word has spread about valuable Spanish artifacts surfacing in this area. I've heard rumors about treasure hunters and artifact dealers asking questions in town." Clara's brief moment of relief evaporated. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggest they know more about your discovery than you might be comfortable with." James leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "Mrs. Morgan, if you found something significant, you need to be very careful about who you trust and how you proceed." Before Clara could respond, Rusty's low growl announced the approach of visitors. Through the window they could see two men on horseback climbing the mountain trail toward the shack. Even at a distance, their purposeful manner and expensive equipment marked them as the outsiders James had warned about. "Those would be the Morrison brothers," James said grimly. "Sheriff Thorne told me they've been asking questions about Spanish coins and old maps. They claim to represent some historical society, but their credentials don't check out." Clara felt her chest tighten with fear. "What do they want?" "Whatever you found, they want it for themselves. And they're not the kind of men who take no for an answer." James began gathering his documents quickly. "Mrs. Morgan, I need you to listen carefully. You have legal rights to anything on your property, but legal rights don't mean much if you can't defend them. These men are dangerous." The riders were close enough now that Clara could see their faces clearly. Jake Morrison's dark eyes swept over her property with predatory intensity, while Samuel's pale gaze seemed to penetrate the shack's thin walls. They dismounted at her gate with the confident manner of men who expected compliance. "What should I do?" Clara whispered. "Tell them nothing," James replied firmly. "Admit to nothing. If they ask about Spanish artifacts, you know nothing about any Spanish artifacts. Can you do that?" Clara nodded, though her heart was pounding so hard she feared it might be audible. Rusty positioned himself between her and the door, his hackles raised and his lips pulled back in a silent snarl that revealed sharp white teeth. Jake Morrison's knock on Clara's door carried the forceful authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. When Clara opened it, she found herself face to face with a man whose smile seemed carved from stone, cold and predatory, despite its attempt at friendliness. "Mrs. Morgan, I presume?" Jake touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of mock courtesy. "I'm Jake Morrison, and this is my brother Samuel. We're with the Territorial Historical Society, investigating reports of significant archaeological discoveries in this area." Clara forced herself to meet his gaze steadily, remembering James's advice about admitting nothing. "I'm afraid I don't know anything about archaeological discoveries, Mr. Morris." Samuel stepped forward from behind his brother, his pale eyes scanning the interior of the shack with obvious interest. "We understand you recently brought some unusual items to the general store in town. Old coins, perhaps? Such artifacts are of great scientific importance. I occasionally find old buttons and buckles when I'm working in my garden," Clara replied carefully. "Nothing that would interest scientists." Jake's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. "Mrs. Morgan, we're not here to cause trouble. The Historical Society simply wants to ensure that any artifacts of cultural significance are properly preserved and studied. We're prepared to offer substantial compensation for your cooperation." James Cooper stepped into view from where he had been standing beside the fireplace, his surveyor's equipment clearly visible on Clara's table. "Gentlemen, I don't believe Mrs. Morgan has anything that would fall under the Historical Society's purview." The Morrison brothers' demeanor shifted instantly upon seeing James. Jake's false courtesy disappeared, replaced by calculating assessment. "And you are?" "James Cooper, Territorial Surveyor. I'm here on official business regarding Mrs. Morgan's property boundaries." James's voice carried the quiet authority of someone comfortable with legal documentation and government procedures. Samuel's eyes narrowed as he studied the maps and documents spread across Clara's table. Boundary disputes can be complicated, especially when they involve historical claims or mining rights. "No disputes here," James replied firmly. "Mrs. Morgan's homestead claim is perfectly legitimate and properly filed. Everything on this property belongs to her under territorial law." Jake took a step closer to the table, his interest clearly piqued by the official-looking documents. "Of course, territorial law only applies to items that fall under American jurisdiction. Artifacts belonging to previous occupants, particularly foreign governments, might be subject to different regulations." Clara felt her palms growing damp with perspiration. The Morrison brothers were dancing around the edges of knowledge they clearly possessed, probing for confirmation of their suspicions while maintaining their false pretense of official authority. "Spain hasn't had any claim to this territory for over 40 years, James said coolly, "and Mexico ceded all rights to the United States in 1848. Any artifacts found on American soil belong to the property owner, regardless of their origin." Samuel pulled a small object from his coat pocket and set it on Clara's table with deliberate care. It was a Spanish coin, nearly identical to the ones Clara had found in Rodriguez's leather pouch. The metal gleamed dully in the afternoon light, filtering through her single window. "This coin was found near a creek about 10 miles south of here," Samuel said quietly. "Our research suggests it's part of a much larger collection that was buried somewhere in this general area. We believe there are maps and documents that could lead us to the primary cache." Clara stared at the coin, her heart racing with the certainty that these men knew far more about Rodriguez's treasure than they were admitting. The coin on her table was proof they had already found at least one of the burial sites marked on the captain's maps. "We're prepared to offer Mrs. Morgan $10,000 for any information that might help us locate the remaining artifacts," Jake announced, producing a thick roll of paper money from his coat. "That's more money than most folks in these mountains see in a lifetime." The sum was staggering, enough to transform Clara's life completely, even without the treasure itself. But something in Jake's manner suggested the offer came with strings attached that might prove more dangerous than poverty. "I appreciate your generous offer," Clara said slowly, "but I don't have any information that would help you. I'm just a poor widow, trying to survive on a mountain homestead." Samuel's pale eyes studied Clara's face with unnerving intensity. "Morgan, we're going to be in the area for several days, conducting a thorough investigation. If you remember anything that might be helpful, we're staying at the hotel in town." Jake picked up his coin and returned it to his pocket with deliberate care. "Sometimes people need time to consider their options. $10,000 could solve a lot of problems for someone in your situation." After the Morrison brothers left, Clara sank into her chair with trembling legs. James moved to the window and watched the two men ride down the mountain trail, their posture suggesting they were far from finished with their investigation. "They know," Clara whispered. "They know about the treasure." "They suspect," James corrected. "But suspicion isn't proof. The question is how much they actually know and what they're willing to do to get it." Rusty padded over to Clara and rested his head against her knee, offering silent comfort. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the mountain peaks, promising the first serious weather of the approaching winter season. The threatening letter arrived 3 days later, slipped under Clara's door sometime during the dark hours before dawn. She found it when she emerged for her morning routine, the crude handwriting immediately filling her with dread. "Mrs. Morgan," the letter read, "accidents happen to people who don't cooperate with reasonable requests. Dogs too. Think carefully about your choices." Clara's hands shook as she read the words again, their meaning unmistakable. Someone was willing to harm both her and Rusty if she continued to refuse their demands. The letter bore no signature, but Clara had no doubt about its origin. Rusty seemed to sense her distress, staying closer than usual as she moved through her morning tasks. When she let him outside, he moved cautiously, sniffing the air and ground with unusual intensity. His behavior suggested he had detected unfamiliar scents around their property. Clara spent the morning checking the primitive security measures she had established. She moved several of the remaining Spanish coins to new hiding places, wrapped the maps and journal in oiled cloth, and buried them in locations she hoped would remain secret, even if someone searched her shack thoroughly. But her precautions felt inadequate against determined adversaries with resources and experience. The Morrison brothers had found her property once. They could certainly return with whatever tools or assistance they deemed necessary. Around midday, Rusty's sharp bark announced an approaching visitor. Clara peered through her window and felt a mixture of relief and concern when she recognized Sheriff Thorne riding up the mountain trail. His official presence might provide temporary safety, but it also suggested the situation had escalated beyond simple intimidation. "Mrs. Morgan," Thorne called as he dismounted, "I need to speak with you about some disturbing reports I've received." Clara opened the door and gestured for him to enter, noting how his eyes swept over her property with professional assessment. Thorne had the alertness of someone expecting trouble, and his hand rested casually near his sidearm. "Someone attempted to poison your dog," he said without preamble. "James Cooper found meat laced with strychnine near your property line this morning. If Rusty had eaten it, he'd be dead within the hour." Clara felt her knees go weak. The threat in the anonymous letter had been real, and only luck had prevented tragedy. Who would do such a thing? The same people who've been asking questions about Spanish treasure and old maps. Thorne replied grimly. "Mrs. Morgan, I know you've been less than completely honest about what you found on your property. Under normal circumstances, I'd respect your privacy, but these aren't normal circumstances." Clara studied the sheriff's weathered face, searching for signs of trustworthiness. Thorne had always treated her fairly, but revealing the truth about Rodriguez's treasure would change everything irrevocably. "The Morrison brothers aren't who they claim to be," Thorne continued. "They're wanted in connection with several violent robberies, and they have a history of intimidating people into revealing the locations of valuable items. If you've found something they want, your life is in serious danger." Before Clara could respond, Rusty's growl drew their attention to the window. Through the glass they could see smoke rising from the direction of Clara's small chicken coop. By the time they reached the structure, flames were consuming the wooden framework, and the few chickens Clara owned were scattered in panicked confusion. "This is a warning," Thorne said, as they watched the coop burn. "Next time it might be your house." Clara felt tears of frustration and fear burning her eyes. The chicken coop represented weeks of work and precious resources she couldn't afford to lose. More importantly, it demonstrated that her tormentors could strike at any time, destroying whatever she valued most. "Sheriff," she said quietly, "what would happen if someone found something valuable on their property? Something that might belong to the government or to foreign interests?" Thorne studied her face carefully. "Depends on what kind of valuable something we're talking about, but generally speaking, anything found on properly claimed American soil belongs to the property owner. The question is whether that person can defend their claim against folks who don't respect legal ownership." Clara made her decision. The danger was escalating beyond her ability to handle alone, and Thorne's reputation for honesty gave her reason to trust him with the truth. "There's something I need to show you," she said. Inside the shack, Clara retrieved Rodriguez's journal and maps from their hiding place beneath a loose floorboard. Thorne examined the documents with growing amazement, his finger tracing the Spanish text and detailed cartography. "Mrs. Morgan, do you understand what you've found here?" he asked finally. "A dead man's treasure that's going to get me killed if I'm not careful." Thorne nodded grimly. "These maps show 3 separate burial sites. If the Morrison brothers get their hands on this information, they'll tear up half the mountain looking for gold, and they'll eliminate anyone who stands in their way." Through the window, the smoldering remains of Clara's chicken coop sent dark smoke into the afternoon sky, a visible reminder that her enemies were watching and waiting for their next opportunity to apply pressure. "What do I do, Sheriff?" Clara asked. "You trust me to help you stay alive long enough to figure that out," Thorne replied. The church bell's bronze voice carried across Copper Creek Valley on Sunday morning. calling the faithful to worship and inadvertently summoning a community debate that would divide the small town for weeks to come. Reverend Samuel Matthews had spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with the moral implications of Clara's discovery, and his sermon would reflect the spiritual complexity of her situation. Clara arrived at the simple wooden church wearing her best dress, a faded blue cotton garment that had seen better days, but remained presentable for public occasions. Rusty waited patiently outside, tied to the hitching post, alongside the horses and mules of other congregants. The dog had become something of a local celebrity since word spread about his role in discovering the treasure. The church filled quickly, with more attendees than Reverend Matthews had seen since Christmas. News of Spanish gold had spread through the community like wildfire, and everyone wanted to hear what the preacher might say about sudden wealth and its moral obligations. Miss Henderson occupied her usual front pew, her sharp eyes taking inventory of every person present and their likely opinions on the treasure matter. She had appointed herself unofficial spokesperson for those who believed Clara should share her good fortune with the community that had supported her during difficult times. James Cooper sat near the back, his surveyor's instruments temporarily set aside for the Sabbath, but his protective instinct still focused on Clara's welfare. He had spent the week researching legal precedents and historical claims, building a comprehensive defense of Clara's ownership rights. Sheriff Thorne positioned himself where he could observe the entire congregation while remaining close to the exits. His investigation of the Morrison brothers had revealed a pattern of violence and intimidation that made him deeply concerned for Clara's safety. Reverend Matthews approached the pulpit with the deliberate pace of a man carrying weighty thoughts. At 62, he had ministered to the Copper Creek community for over 20 years, guiding them through mining disasters, harsh winters and personal tragedies that tested faith and character. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to difficult conversations, "we gather today in the shadow of events that have stirred both excitement and concern within our community. The discovery of treasure, particular treasure with historical significance, raises questions that extend far beyond material wealth." Clara felt every eye in the church turn toward her, some filled with curiosity, others with barely concealed resentment. She had expected this attention, but the intensity still made her uncomfortable. "Scripture tells us that the love of money is the root of all evil," Matthews continued, "but it also teaches us that God provides for our needs in mysterious ways. The question before us is not whether Miss Morgan has the right to keep what she found on her own property, but how our community responds to her good fortune." Tom Bradley, a grizzled miner whose claims had never produced anything more valuable than fool's gold, stood up from his pew. "Reverend, that woman's been living on charity from this community for 2 years. Now she's sitting on a fortune while the rest of us struggle to feed our families. Don't seem right that she should keep it all to herself." Several voices murmured agreement, while others shook their heads in disapproval of Bradley's public challenge. Clara felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger at the suggestion that she had been a burden on the community. "Miss Bradley raises an important point about community responsibility," Matthews acknowledged diplomatically, "but we must also consider the principles of property rights and individual liberty that form the foundation of our territorial government." Sarah Duncan, the school teacher, rose to speak. "Reverend, I've been teaching the children about Spanish explorers and the history of this territory. If Mrs. Morgan has found artifacts from that period, don't they belong in a museum where everyone can learn from them?" "That's a thoughtful perspective, Miss Duncan," Matthews replied. "Historical preservation serves the common good, but it shouldn't come at the expense of individual rights." James Cooper stood slowly, his voice carrying the authority of someone familiar with legal documentation. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've researched this matter thoroughly. Under territorial law, anything found on properly claimed homestead land belongs to the landowner. Mrs. Morgan's claim is legitimate and properly filed. The law is clear on this matter. Laws can be changed," called out Pete Morrison, the town's blacksmith and no relation to the notorious brothers, "especially when they don't serve the community's best interests." The debate continued for another hour, with opinions dividing roughly along economic lines. Those who struggled financially saw Clara's treasure as an opportunity for community improvement, while property owners defended her right to keep what she had found. Throughout the discussion, Clara remained silent, overwhelmed by the realization that her private discovery had become a public controversy. The treasure she had hoped would solve her problems was creating new conflicts she had never anticipated. When the service finally ended, Clara found herself surrounded by well-wishers, critics, and advice givers, each offering their opinion on what she should do with her newfound wealth. The bronze church bell that had called them together continued to resonate across the valley, its voice carrying both celebration and warning to anyone willing to listen. Judge Cornelius Whitmore arrived in Copper Creek on the Tuesday morning stage, his black robes and stern demeanor immediately establishing his authority over the growing legal complications surrounding Clara's treasure claim. At 67, Judge Whitmore had presided over territorial disputes for nearly 3 decades, earning a reputation for fair but uncompromising adherence to legal precedent. The courthouse proceedings took place in Henderson's Mercantile, the only building in town large enough to accommodate the interested parties and curious spectators. Miss Henderson had cleared her merchandise to one side, creating an improvised courtroom with wooden crates serving as benches and her counter functioning as the judge's bench. Clara sat between James Cooper and Sheriff Thorne, her hands folded tightly in her lap as she watched Judge Whitmore review the stack of documents that would determine her fate. The official legal papers included her homestead claim, territorial surveys, property tax records, and affidavits from various witnesses. The Morrison brothers occupied chairs near the front, their expensive suits and confident demeanor creating an atmosphere of professional authority. Jake had hired a lawyer from Denver, a sharp-eyed man named Franklin Pierce, who specialized in mining law and property disputes. Your Honor, Pierce began when called upon to present his case. My clients represent legitimate salvage interests, with prior claim to the artifacts in question. The Spanish colonial government granted specific mining and exploration rights to Captain Miguel Rodriguez in 1847, and those rights were never formally revoked. Pierce produced a document bearing official-looking seals and signatures. This concession grants Captain Rodriguez exclusive rights to precious metals and artifacts discovered within a 50-square-mile area that includes Mrs. Morgan's current property. Under international law, these rights supersede any subsequent American homestead claims. Judge Whitmore examined the document carefully, his experienced eyes noting details that might escape casual observation. Mr. Pierce, this concession predates American sovereignty over this territory. Spain lost control of this region to Mexico in 1821, and Mexico ceded it to the United States in 18... With respect, Your Honor, the treaty specifically protected existing property rights of Mexican citizens, and Captain Rodriguez was operating under Mexican authority when he established his claim. James Cooper rose to object. Your Honor, there's no evidence that Captain Rodriguez ever filed his claim with Mexican authorities, and even if he had, he abandoned any rights when he failed to return for the treasure within the statutory period. The legal arguments continued for hours, with each side citing territorial statutes, federal regulations, and international treaties. Clara found herself lost in the technical language, but she understood that her future hung in the balance of legal interpretations she couldn't fully comprehend. During a recess, Sheriff Thorne pulled Clara aside with disturbing news. Mrs. Morgan, I've been investigating the Morrison brothers' background more thoroughly. That salvage company they claim to represent doesn't exist. The documents they're using are forgeries. Can't you arrest them for fraud? Not without more evidence. Judge Whitmore is focused on the legal precedents, not the character of the people making claims. If their argument has merit under territorial law, their personal honesty might not matter. When proceedings resumed, Pierce presented his strongest argument. Your Honor, we're not just talking about a few old coins. Our research indicates this treasure represents millions of dollars in gold and silver that rightfully belongs to the heirs of Captain Rodriguez's expedition. Miss Morgan's accidental discovery doesn't give her the right to steal a dead man's legacy. The emotional appeal struck home with several spectators, and Clara could see doubt creeping into Judge Whitmore's expression. The treasure's enormous value was becoming a factor in determining its rightful ownership. James Cooper requested permission to present additional evidence. He unrolled a detailed survey map showing property boundaries and mining claims dating back to territorial organization. "Your Honor, I've researched every official filing in this district. There's no record of any Spanish or Mexican claim to this specific property. Mrs. Morgan's homestead is properly filed and legally valid." But Pierce had one more surprise. He produced a leather portfolio containing what appeared to be Rodriguez's original exploration maps, showing the treasure locations marked with Spanish notations and official seals. These maps were recovered from the captain's possessions after his death, Pierce explained. They clearly establish prior knowledge and intent to return for the treasure. Under salvage law, prior knowledge creates continuing rights that survive temporary abandonment. Judge Whitmore studied the maps intently, comparing them to the surveys James had presented. The legal complexity was growing beyond simple property rights into questions of international law, historical claims, and territorial jurisdiction. This case involves legal principles that extend far beyond local property disputes, the judge announced. "I'm calling a recess until tomorrow morning to review the relevant statutes and precedents. This decision will affect not just Mrs. Morgan's claim, but how we handle similar discoveries throughout the territory." As the courtroom emptied, Clara realized that her simple treasure discovery had become a test case that would influence territorial law for years to come. The Morrison brothers' knowing smiles suggested they were confident in their legal strategy, while James Cooper's worried expression indicated the battle was far from over. That evening, Clara sat alone in her shack, with Martha's worn Bible open in her lap, seeking comfort in familiar verses while her world crumbled around her. The legal proceedings had drained her emotionally, and the prospect of losing everything she had fought to protect filled her with despair that went deeper than mere poverty. As she turned the pages, looking for the passage about God providing for the sparrows, a folded piece of paper fell from between the thin pages near the book of Proverbs. Clara had never noticed it before, though she had read Martha's Bible countless times since her sister's death. The paper was yellowed with age, written in Martha's careful handwriting but dated 3 years before her death. Clara's hands trembled as she unfolded it, revealing words that would change everything she thought she knew about the treasure. "My dearest Clara," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then God has seen fit to reveal what I have kept hidden these many years. I pray you will understand why I chose silence over truth, and forgive me for the burden I am placing upon your shoulder." Clara's heart pounded as she continued reading. Martha had known about the treasure, not just known about it, but found portions of it herself during her explorations of the mountain trail. "I discovered the first cache 5 years ago while gathering herbs near the creek," Martha's letter continued. "At first I thought I had found some miner's forgotten stash, but the Spanish coins and strange documents told a different story. I spent months researching what I could in the territorial library, piecing together the truth about Captain Rodriguez and his lost expedition." Clara felt tears burning her eyes as she realized the magnitude of Martha's secret. Her sister had carried this knowledge alone, never sharing the discovery that could have transformed their lives. "I found the captain's journal buried with the first cache," Martha wrote. "His story broke my heart, Clara. He was not just a treasure hunter or conquistador seeking personal wealth. Captain Rodriguez was a man of faith, transporting gold and silver, intended to fund Spanish missions among the native tribes. When bandits attacked his expedition, he chose to bury the treasure, rather than let it fall into evil hands." The letter explained that Martha had reburied the treasure after reading Rodriguez's journal, convinced that the captain's original purpose should be honored. The gold and silver had been intended for charitable works, not personal enrichment. "I studied the maps carefully and located all 3 burial sites," Martha continued. "The wealth hidden in these mountains could feed every hungry person in Colorado Territory and build schools and hospitals that would serve generations. But I also understood that such treasure would attract the worst kinds of men, willing to kill for gold regardless of its intended purpose." Clara's hands shook as she read Martha's explanation of her decision. Rather than claim the treasure or reveal its location, Martha had chosen to leave it buried until circumstances arose that would allow it to fulfill Rodriguez's original mission. "I have prepared detailed instructions for accessing the treasure safely," the letter continued, "along with Captain Rodriguez's own writings about how the wealth should be distributed. But Clara, you must understand that claiming this treasure will put your life in danger. There are men who would kill for far less than what lies buried on our mountain." Martha had included a hand-drawn map showing not just the 3 burial sites, but safe routes between them and hiding places where the treasure could be stored temporarily. Her knowledge of the local terrain was extensive, reflecting years of careful observation and planning. "If God wills that you should inherit this responsibility," Martha concluded, "remember that wealth without purpose is merely a burden." Captain Rodriguez intended this goal to help the poor and suffering. His spirit will not rest until his mission is completed, whether by his own hands or by someone worthy enough to carry on his work. The letter was signed with Martha's full name and dated just weeks before her consumption began to manifest serious symptoms. Clara realized that her sister had known death was approaching and had used her final healthy days to prepare these instructions. Hidden beneath the letter, Clara found another document that made her gasp with recognition. It was Captain Rodriguez's original mission orders, written in Spanish but bearing official seals that proved his expedition was indeed intended for charitable purposes. The document specified that any recovered treasure should be used to establish missions, schools, and medical facilities for frontier communities. Clara set the papers aside and stared into the flickering candlelight, overwhelmed by the moral weight Martha had placed upon her shoulders. The treasure was not just a means of personal survival, but a sacred trust that connected her to a man who had died protecting it 40 years ago. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the mountain peaks, promising the season's first serious snowfall. Clara could hear Rusty moving restlessly near the door, sensing her emotional turmoil and the approaching weather that would soon trap them in their mountain home for the long winter months ahead. The knowledge that Martha had carried this secret alone filled Clara with both admiration and sorrow. Her sister had been stronger and wiser than Clara had ever realized, protecting not just the treasure, but the spiritual purpose it represented. The revelation of Martha's letter gave Clara new strength as she faced Judge Whitmore's court the following morning. Armed with Captain Rodriguez's original mission orders and Martha's detailed documentation, she finally possessed evidence that could expose the Morrison brothers' fraudulent claims while establishing the treasure's true purpose. But Jake Morrison had not spent the night idle. When Clara arrived at the makeshift courtroom, she found him conferring with 2 additional men whose hard faces and expensive equipment suggested they were reinforcements brought in for purposes that extended beyond legal proceedings. James Cooper noticed Clara's pale complexion as she studied the newcomers. "Mrs. Morgan, those men arrived on the late stage last night. They're asking questions around town about mountain trails and escape routes. I don't think they're planning to accept whatever decision Judge Whitmore reaches." The morning session began with Judge Whitmore's announcement that he had researched the relevant legal precedents throughout the night. His weathered face showed the strain of wrestling with complex jurisdictional questions that had no clear answers in territorial law. "Before I render my decision," the judge announced, "I want to give both parties an opportunity to present any additional evidence they may have discovered." Clara stood slowly, her heart pounding as she prepared to reveal Martha's letter and Rodriguez's mission order. But before she could speak, Jake Morrison rose with documents of his own. "Your Honor, overnight research has revealed additional information about Captain Rodriguez's expedition," Jake announced with confident authority. "We have obtained testimony from Mexican government archives proving that Captain Rodriguez was acting as a private citizen, not an official representative. Any treasure he buried was his personal property, not government funds." The documents Jake presented appeared official, complete with elaborate seals and signatures that seemed to validate his claims. Clara felt her hope crumbling as she realized the Morrison brothers had anticipated every possible defense and prepared convincing counter-arguments. Furthermore, Jake continued, "We have located additional cache sites that prove Mrs. Morgan has been systematically looting archaeological materials without proper permits. Her possession of Spanish artifacts constitutes theft of cultural heritage items that belong in proper museums." Samuel Morrison stood and placed a leather satchel on the judge's bench. Inside were Spanish coins, jewelry and small artifacts that appeared to come from the same historical period as Rodriguez's treasure. Clara realized with growing horror that the Morrison brothers had found and looted at least one of the 3 burial sites marked on the captain's maps. These items were recovered from a site approximately 2 miles from Mrs. Morgan's property, Samuel announced. The cache had been recently disturbed, suggesting ongoing illegal excavation activities. Judge Whitmore examined the artifacts carefully, his expression growing more troubled as he considered the implications. If Clara had indeed been secretly looting multiple sites, her legal claim to the treasure would be severely compromised. "Mrs. Morgan," the judge said gravely, "do you have any explanation for these allegations?" Clara felt the weight of every eye in the courtroom as she stood to respond. This was the moment of truth that would determine not just her financial future, but her reputation and freedom. She reached into her coat and withdrew Martha's letter and Rodriguez's mission orders. "Your Honor, I have evidence that changes everything about this case," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "These documents prove that Captain Rodriguez's treasure was never intended for personal wealth, and that my sister knew about its location years before I discovered it." As Clara began to explain Martha's letter, a commotion outside interrupted the proceedings. Sheriff Thorne burst through the door, his face grim with urgency. "Judge Whitmore, I need to speak with you immediately," Thorne announced. "I've received a telegraph from the Territorial Marshal's office. The Morrison brothers are wanted fugitives, and the documents they've presented are forgeries." Jake Morrison's confident demeanor cracked for the first time as he exchanged glances with his brother and their hired reinforcements. The careful legal strategy they had constructed was collapsing under official scrutiny. Furthermore, Thorne continued, "I have evidence that these men have been systematically looting archaeological sites throughout the territory, selling artifacts to private collectors without regard for their historical significance." Samuel Morrison stood abruptly, his hand moving toward his coat in a gesture that made everyone in the room tense. "Sheriff, you're interfering with legitimate legal proceedings." "No," Thorne replied firmly, his own hand resting on his sidearm. "I'm arresting known criminals who have been operating under false pretenses." The tension in the improvised courtroom was palpable as the Morrison brothers realized their legal facade was crumbling. Their hired men shifted position, clearly prepared for violence if their employers gave the signal. Judge Whitmore maintained his composure, despite the dangerous undercurrents swirling around his courtroom. "Sheriff Thorne, please present your evidence in an orderly fashion. This court will not be disrupted by accusations that cannot be properly substantiated." Clara clutched Martha's letter tightly, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether justice prevailed or whether the Morrison brothers would resort to the violence they had used throughout their criminal careers. The first snowfall of winter began as Clara barricaded herself inside her shack, the Morrison brothers' escaped accomplices circling her property like wolves, sensing wounded prey. Judge Whitmore's emergency session had ended in chaos when Jake and Samuel Morrison fled custody during Sheriff Thorne's attempt to arrest them, leaving their hired men to complete whatever violent plan they had conceived as backup to their failed legal strategy. Clara checked the load in Thomas's old hunting rifle for the 3rd time, her hands steady, despite the terror coursing through her veins. Rusty paced between the windows, his hackles raised and a low growl rumbling continuously in his throat. The dog's acute senses detected movements in the swirling snow that Clara's eyes couldn't penetrate. "Easy, boy," Clara whispered, though she found comfort in Rusty's alertness. "We've made it through worse storms than this." But they had never faced a storm that included armed men, determined to kill for treasure. Clara had moved Rodriguez's journal and maps to a hiding place beneath the root cellar's false floor, along with most of the remaining Spanish coins. If the worst happened, at least the historical documents might survive to tell their story. The blizzard had transformed the familiar landscape into an alien wilderness where sound carried strangely and visibility extended only a few yards in any direction. Clara could hear horses moving somewhere beyond her fence line, but the swirling snow made it impossible to determine how many men were positioning themselves around her property. A sharp crack from the direction of the lean-to kitchen told Clara that someone was testing the structural weak points of her modest home. Thomas had built the addition hastily, and its walls would not withstand serious assault. She moved away from that side of the shack, positioning herself where she could cover multiple approaches while keeping Rusty close. The first real attack came without warning. A burning bundle crashed through her single window, scattering glass and igniting the curtains. Martha had sewn during their first winter in Colorado territory. Clara smothered the flames with a blanket while Rusty barked furiously at the broken window. Mrs. Morgan, and a voice called from outside, barely audible above the wind. "Send out the maps, and we'll let you live. You've got 1 minute to decide." Clara knew the offer was worthless. Men who burned buildings and threatened women would not honor agreements once they had what they wanted. She extinguished the oil lamp, plunging the shack into darkness that would make her harder to target, while allowing her to see the glow of any approaching torches or lanterns. The second attack came through the lean-to, as Clara had anticipated. The sound of splintering wood told her that axes were making quick work of the flimsy construction. She aimed the rifle toward the noise and waited for a clear target. When the first man pushed through the damaged wall, Clara's shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing back into the snow. His scream of pain and surprise was audible even above the storm, and Clara heard shouted curses from his companions. "She's armed," someone yelled. "Circle around to the front." Clara reloaded quickly, grateful for the hunting lessons Thomas had insisted upon during their brief marriage. She had never imagined using those skills against human targets, but survival instincts override civilized reservations when death approaches. Rusty suddenly charged toward the front door, snarling with protective fury that Clara had never witnessed before. Through the broken window, she glimpsed a figure approaching with a torch, clearly intending to set the entire shack ablaze. Clara's second shot shattered the torch and sent the arsonist diving for cover behind her fence posts. But the brief muzzle flash revealed at least 3 more men moving through the snow from different directions, coordinating their assault with military precision. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Clara had perhaps 6 more cartridges for the rifle, and reloading in darkness while under attack would be nearly impossible. The Morrison brothers' hired killers were professionals who would eventually overwhelm her defenses through sheer persistence and superior numbers. But the blizzard that aided their concealment also worked against them. The swirling snow muffled approaching footsteps and made accurate shooting difficult for attackers and defender alike. Clara had the advantage of knowing her property's layout, while her enemies were navigating unfamiliar terrain in hostile weather. A new sound penetrated the storm's howling, the unmistakable rhythm of multiple horses approaching at speed from down the mountain trail. Clara's heart leaped with desperate hope that Sheriff Thorne was arriving with reinforcements, but she quickly realized the riders were approaching from the wrong direction. James Cooper's voice cut through the blizzard like salvation itself. "Mrs. Morgan, we're coming to help." The surveyor had brought allies. Clara could hear at least 4 different voices shouting coordination commands as they spread out to engage the Morrison brothers' men. Gunfire erupted across her property as the 2 forces clashed in the swirling darkness. Clara pressed herself against the shack's interior wall, clutching Martha's wedding ring in her free hand while gripping the rifle with the other. The simple gold band had been her sister's most precious possession, a symbol of love that had sustained Martha through the hardships of frontier life. Outside, the battle raged through the worst blizzard of the season, with her future hanging in the balance. Dawn broke over a transformed landscape where the blizzard's fury had given way to pristine silence. broken only by the crunch of boots on fresh snow as territorial marshals secured the scene of the previous night's battle. The Morrison brothers lay dead in Clara's yard, their criminal careers ended by James Cooper's precise marksmanship and Sheriff Thorne's timely arrival with federal reinforcements. Clara emerged from her damaged shack to find her property occupied by a small army of officials. Territorial Marshal William Hayes had arrived from Denver with a warrant for the Morrison brothers' arrest, along with documentation proving their involvement in a string of violent robberies across 3 territories. "Miss Morgan," Marshal Hayes said, removing his hat respectfully as he approached, "I apologize for the delay in our response. We've been tracking the Morrison brothers for 8 months, but they always managed to stay one step ahead of the law." Judge Whitmore stood beside a pile of evidence recovered from the dead men's saddlebags, forged documents, stolen artifacts, and detailed maps showing locations of archaeological sites they had looted throughout the region. Their criminal enterprise had been far more extensive than anyone had imagined. "Your Honor," Clara said to the judge, "I have evidence that changes everything about the treasure's legal status." She produced Martha's letter and Captain Rodriguez's original mission orders, their authenticity verified by the territorial archivist who had accompanied Marshal Hayes from Denver. Judge Whitmore examined the documents carefully, his weathered face reflecting growing amazement as he read Rodriguez's detailed instructions for distributing the treasure's wealth among frontier communities. The captain's mission orders specifically designated the gold and silver for establishing schools, medical facilities, and assistance programs for struggling settlements. "Miss Morgan, these documents establish that Captain Rodriguez was indeed acting under official authority when he buried the treasure," the judge announced. "Furthermore, they prove that the treasure was intended for charitable purposes, not personal enrichment. Under territorial law, you have clear legal title to these assets." James Cooper stepped forward with a leather portfolio containing the expanded property deed he had prepared. "Judge Whitmore, I've surveyed the entire area where the treasure sites are located. Miss Morgan's homestead claim covers all 3 burial locations, giving her undisputed ownership of the complete cache. The new deed expanded Clara's property rights to include an additional 40 acres, encompassing the rocky outcroppings and creek areas where Rodriguez had hidden his expedition's wealth. The legal documentation would protect her claim against any future challenges, while establishing her as the legitimate owner of one of the largest treasure discoveries in territorial history. Marshal Hayes provided additional evidence that vindicated Clara's position. "Miss Morgan, our investigation has revealed that the Morrison brothers had been systematically looting Spanish colonial sites throughout Colorado and New Mexico territories. They used forged historical documents to convince local officials they were legitimate archaeologists, then sold the artifacts to private collectors back east. The Marshals team had recovered hundreds of stolen items from the brothers' hideout in Denver, including authentic Spanish colonial artifacts that belonged in museums rather than private collections. Their fraudulent documentation had been sophisticated enough to fool local authorities, but territorial archives in Santa Fe had no record of the historical claims they fabricated. The Morrison brothers never had any legitimate claim to Captain Rodriguez's treasure, Judge Whitmore concluded. Their entire legal strategy was based on forged documents and false historical interpretations designed to intimidate you into surrendering your rightful property. Clara felt overwhelming relief wash over her as the legal nightmare finally ended. The treasure that had threatened to destroy her life was now officially recognized as her legal property, free from any competing claims or historical complications. Sheriff Thorne approached with additional good news. "Miss Morgan, the territorial government is prepared to offer you protection and assistance in managing your newfound wealth. Governor Evans has expressed interest in using part of the treasure to fund territorial development projects. With your permission and participation." The offer represented exactly what Captain Rodriguez had intended, using the treasure's wealth to benefit frontier communities struggling with the challenges of territorial development. Clara could honor both Martha's wisdom and the Spanish captain's original mission, while securing her own future. "There's one more thing," James Cooper said quietly, producing a small object wrapped in soft cloth. We found this among Martha's possessions when we searched the shack for additional evidence. Inside the cloth was a new collar for Rusty, crafted from Spanish silver and engraved with words that brought tears to Clara's eyes. To Rusty, the faithful friend who changed everything. Martha had commissioned the collar months before her death, somehow knowing that her dog would play a crucial role in revealing the treasure's location. Clara knelt beside Rusty and fastened the silver collar around his neck, the precious metal gleaming against his brown fur like a medal of honor. The dog wagged his tail enthusiastically, as if he understood the significance of the ceremony that marked the end of their struggle and the beginning of a new chapter in their lives together. 6 months later, the sound of hammers and saws echoed across Copper Creek Valley as construction crews worked to complete the schoolhouse that would serve as Clara's first major contribution to the community that had supported her through difficult times. The 2-story brick building stood on a rise overlooking the town, its bell tower visible from every home in the valley. Clara supervised the construction from her new house, a modest but comfortable structure built on the foundation where her old shack had stood. She had resisted James Cooper's suggestions for a mansion, preferring to invest the treasure's wealth in community improvements rather than personal luxury. The house included modern conveniences like indoor plumbing and a proper kitchen, but its scale remained appropriate for a woman who valued substance over display. The architectural plans, spread across Clara's dining room table, showed the scope of her charitable vision. In addition to the nearly completed school, she had commissioned designs for a medical clinic, a library, and improved roads connecting Copper Creek to neighboring settlements. The projects would provide employment for local workers while creating infrastructure that would benefit the region for generations. Miss Sarah Duncan, the schoolteacher, visited regularly to discuss curriculum and educational supplies for the new facility. The enhanced school would accommodate students from throughout the valley, offering advanced instruction that had previously required families to send their children to Denver for proper education. Morgan, the children are so excited about the new science laboratory, Sarah reported during her weekly visit. Having proper equipment will allow us to teach subjects that frontier schools rarely offer. Some of these children might even qualify for territorial university programs. Clara found deep satisfaction in honoring Captain Rodriguez's original mission while fulfilling Martha's wisdom about using wealth responsibly. The Spanish captain's detailed instructions had provided a framework for distributing the treasure's value in ways that created lasting benefit rather than temporary comfort. Benjamin Foster had agreed to establish the valley's first permanent medical practice, attracted by Clara's offer to fund a fully equipped clinic and provide housing for his family. His arrival would end the dangerous necessity of traveling to Denver for serious medical treatment, potentially saving lives during emergencies when winter weather made transportation impossible. The clinic should be operational by autumn. Foster reported during a planning meeting in Clara's parlor. Having proper surgical facilities and medical supplies will transform healthcare delivery throughout this region. Word is already spreading to neighboring valleys about the services we'll be able to provide. James Cooper had become Clara's closest advisor and most trusted friend during the complex process of managing sudden wealth. His expertise in territorial law and property management proved invaluable as Clara navigated the legal and practical challenges of distributing millions of dollars in Spanish gold and silver. Clara, the territorial governor, has requested a meeting about expanding your development program to other mining districts, James announced during his daily visit. Your success in Copper Creek has attracted attention from officials who want to replicate these improvements elsewhere. The territorial government's interest represented validation of Clara's approach to charitable investment. Rather than simply donating money to existing institutions, she had created new infrastructure that would generate economic activity while addressing community needs. Reverend Matthews had blessed each construction project, viewing Clara's charitable works as evidence of divine providence working through human generosity.